looks like we're getting everybody here and getting going. So without further ado, I'd really like to dive into this because I think it is a good topic for us to consider. And I will tell you that what sort of prompted this idea for me is two things. Number one, I come to Acquira from a background of doing executive coaching and leadership development on top of business advisory work as a former banker. And I'm always biased to the mind game we have to play to be successful business owners and leaders. So for me, that is always an ever-present consideration when I hear people starting to share concerns and issues, and in some cases, obvious frustration or fear about what they're learning about a deal or where it's going. And my observation is that, so that's kind of point number one. Point number two is my observation when I really trace back and look at some of the questions that frequently get raised in our Slack channels and in our workshops and things. A lot of it ultimately comes back to the really core fundamental of what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur? And I would argue it starts first with a mindset. You can learn how to be an incredible analyst, to look at numbers, make projections, make assumptions, do market survey, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is critically important. But at the base of it and underlying that whole game is your own mindset about what you're doing and how you want to go about doing it. So I thought it would be good to have a session where we maybe explore a really basic question. What does it take to be an entrepreneur? And I think what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you guys, I'd like to just kind of throw that out to the group here and have people sort of maybe share if you pondered that question when you began this journey, to share what your thinking was and whether or not you've changed that thinking as you've gone through some of the experiences you've gone through. And I realized looking at the roster here, we got a lot of people that are in a lot of different stages. Casey's with us. He's getting ready to close on a deal. He's very near the goal line. Gloria, there will be a special place in heaven for you for everything you've been through trying to find a deal. But, blessings to you for your diligence in sticking with it and going for it. Kelly, you just went through a kind of an emotional upheaval at the last workshop, realizing that the deal you thought you had was probably not going to be good. So anyway, there's all of that range of experience and ultimately emotion that kicks into it. So let's get back to that basic question. What do you think it takes to be a successful entrepreneur? Anybody want to go first?
Grit.
Grit, okay. Yeah, don't disagree.
Relentless optimism in the face of adversity.
I think you have to be willing to wear a whole lot of different hats. I mean, I've actually, one of the things I've enjoyed the most over the past many months of this search is, flipping between, financial considerations to operational, all the different things you have to consider. And then, developing a relationship with a seller, it just brings, you have to bring all these different things together. You get to wear a lot of different hats. I mean, that for somebody that has ADD like I do, it can either be a good thing or a bad thing. It just depends on the day.
Sure. No, that's a good point though, because absolutely in the early going, you are wearing many different hats until a team can be identified and assembled around you. Okay. Who else?
I think that you really have to be disciplined. And what I mean is that you're doing this on your own. No one's calling you and asking you for that meeting on Thursday morning. You are creating that meeting on Thursday morning. You are looking at your list and saying what's next. And you're also disciplined on what is it I need to learn and what is it that I need to keep going on.
Right. Right. Good point. Very good point. Yeah, you're really driving the train.
And it's a messy world. That's the hard part. So being able to get the discipline to drill it down to those small steps you need to do to hit that bigger step. It's a very good attribute.
All good points. Any others?
This is Casey here. One thing that's coming to my mind is something I read in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it's about differentiating between management and leadership. And we're talking about these different hats. And as the entrepreneur owner, we'll have to wear those hats. We'll have to manage everything. We'll have to be really careful and have our boundaries and guard our time so we don't lose all of our time in managing. And we still have time to climb the tree and look ahead and see where we're going and lead the company.
Yeah, good point.
And it can be so hard when you're so busy to just get caught up in every little task and putting out the fires. And we have to keep our heads on our shoulders and look ahead and make sure that we're looking at the big picture and not just getting caught up in today's problem.
Right. Good point. Good point. Many of these ideas we're going to come back to. I actually do have an outline of what I'd like to share with you, and you've already touched on some of the crossovers that are in my list, but any other thoughts real quick before we move on?
I think we need to learn and adopt and move further any obstacles that can be on our way. Be resilient.
Right.
And focus. Yeah. Very focused.
Yeah, a lot to be said for paying attention to the learning you might get from the experience, because not every situation is going to turn out the way you originally expected it. It may still be a workable, acceptable answer, but just because it's not exactly the way you wanted it or thought it was going to be, doesn't make it a bad one. And being able to kind of widen the lens and look at those other options and other views of the moment. Yeah, for sure. Very important. Nick, you got something else?
Yeah, final thing is I would just say acceptance to yourself that what you're doing is unusual and that's okay. You will have people coming to you saying, why don't you just get a normal job? Why would you put yourself through all this? Why are you doing this? And it can feed that voice in your head, like, why am I stepping aside? And so to be a successful entrepreneur, I think, is really being okay with doing something different, even when everyone is telling you that you're doing it wrong.
Right. Very good point. Very good. Well, there's one area that, interestingly, nobody talked about specifically, and in my humble opinion, it is potentially the very jumping off point for making a decision to step out there as an entrepreneur. And that is the idea of your own relationship with risk. And one could argue that everything we do in this life has a certain element of risk. I mean, just, waking up in the morning and getting into your car and driving out into traffic, there's a certain kind of risk that's associated with that. The places we choose to buy our food, and there's arguably an element of risk there. Do you trust the food prep people, and are the conditions in the kitchen clean, and are you going to get sick from eating there? I mean, on the one hand, you can drive yourself crazy with a near zero tolerance of risk, but we all learn to accept and adopt levels of risk without even particularly calling them that, and not even thinking about it. We just go do the thing. And I think when it comes to the business, most of you and I know there's a few variations to this story, but most of you are joining Aquara from a corporate world. You've spent some time on the corporate wheel. You've had, successful careers. You've done certain things. You've accomplished certain milestones. You've gotten titles. You've made advancement, etc. But now you've begun the process of saying, I know there's more for my life, for my family, and for what I want to be doing. So I think this is the answer for me, is to become an entrepreneur. But even just trying to make that declaration still involves some granularity of trying to define the working elements of the risk you're going to incur. And that's one of the reasons that we have you start the process with us creating an investment thesis. Because if you really think about the investment thesis for a moment, what you're doing is you're methodically answering questions about potential risk that you're going to encounter. Things like, am I willing to quit my day job? That's risk number one. Am I willing to relocate myself and my family to get to a market that has the right kind of business available? And when I start looking at the businesses, are there things about particular industries, particular segments, or particular structure within a business that I may or may not be comfortable taking on? So it's 1,000 questions to think about, but I occasionally get concerned when I read somebody's investment thesis that seems like there wasn't necessarily a lot of thought put into it. It was just kind of like, oh, I've got this flash of an inspiration. Owning a plumbing company in Denver sounds like a cool idea. That's where I want to go. I've always wanted to live in Denver. Denver market looks good to me. Bang, you go. Well, on one hand, that might be a perfectly fine answer for somebody that has a near zero aversion to risk. They're gamblers, they're risk takers, they want to be smart, but their tolerance of risk is way greater than other people's tolerance. And I know often when we get into some of the discussions on the Slack channel about details that start to emerge as you begin the fact finding and the due diligence, you read a sim and it says, well, this business is half service and half installation. So, okay, on the surface, that sounds good. Sounds like it would fit an investment thesis, because service means recurring revenue opportunity. That's good. I'm not always chasing new clients. That's good. But then you learn in due diligence that they kind of overstated the service component, and maybe they've only done 20% service and everything else is chasing new business all the time. Well, that's most definitely a different profile, and it creates a whole lot of different classes and categories of risk. So what do you think about that? How does that impact how you may be thinking about your business? So let me stop there a moment and let me ask the question back to the group. Would anybody be willing to share your own journey in the thought process that you may have done identifying your risk tolerances or risk aversion, one way or another? Anybody got a story they want to share?
I mean, Doug, I'll throw my hat in the ring on this one. I mean, for me, like personally, the opportunity cost of kind of making what I'm making the corporate job is just too high. Now that I've gotten older, and I realize that looking to buy a business, probably trading one set of problems and concerns for another. And there's a lot on the other side, but I'm willing to take on, that risk. And I think just honestly, I'm, getting to an age now where probably one of the biggest drivers for me is like, if I don't do this now, I'm not going to be able to do this in a few years. Like I'm running out of years that it's reasonable to do this stuff without people really thinking you're crazy. So, I'm excited about it. And I think it means that I have to be willing to take on more risk, but there's only a kind of a bit of runway we all have to work with while you can take that risk. So it's sort of a risk adjusted perception on or how I want to go about this and what the risk I'm willing to take in the types of deals I'm looking for.
Yeah. Most agreed.
The way that I'll be honest with you, I don't view this whole, and it's just me because I've kind of done a lot of freelancing over the years, right? I've been self-employed, right? Kind of like a one-man show, mainly doing a lot of consulting with my tech skills, right? Either building websites or helping people with marketing. But the main reason that this kind of applies, is so attractive to me is I just don't see it. And again, maybe this is kind of what you were alluding to. Some people have different risk tolerances, right? And some people view things just completely differently, right? But when we're buying a business, to me, the fact that you're in control, right? You're in the driver's seat. It's, you know what I mean? Like if you had to, you can go whatever problem, at least in my mind, right? Any problem that comes up, I'm confident that I can figure it out, right? Because if I didn't figure it out, the old owner would have had to figure it out. And is that guy much smarter? I like to think that, whatever problem there is that might come up that we have no idea, whatever it is, that I can navigate through it, right? Because I'm not a special snowflake, right? Everybody's going to have problems, right? Nobody's going to buy a business and it's just going to be like, oh man, this is the best thing ever, right? I'm talking with one guy in a separate group where he just bought an electrician business, right? And he's going through it, you know what I mean? But he's also got his head up, he's trying to hire people and he's getting blown off and he's doing this, but he's knocking down every door and making it work, right? And I think that's really the attitude that's required, right? If you're gonna take on a bunch of debt and do this thing, right? Take over somebody else's business and really do it. You got to have the mindset of whatever happens, I'm gonna figure it out, right?
Right.
And if you don't, then the first time something happens, right? It's like if there's ever an emergency, the worst thing you can do is panic, right? Because then you just shut down. You're not thinking clearly, or in any even a medical whatever, right? Whatever the situation is, and I don't think it's any different in business.
Yeah. Well, James, if I may feedback on that, and thanks for sharing that. What you described, number one, you're a person that has chosen, it sounds like early on, to kind of go the independent route. So you've been doing it for a while. You've been a sole provider, a sole contributor. You've been running your freelancing, your consulting, and your work. And you've already, just by the sheer nature of that, demonstrated some of those incredibly independent characteristics. You don't need the surety and security of a corporate job to cut a paycheck. Now, obviously you recruit clients from those entities to do work for, and that's great. But that's a whole lot different than getting on somebody else's payroll and knowing that fundamentally, without a lot of things can go wrong, and come payday, you're going to get a paycheck.
Yeah.
And that's that kind of security and surety that some people do struggle with walking away from. So, Nick, you had a hand up?
Yeah, going off what James said is, maybe about risk. He's got a background where he's done some consulting, he's done some things individually, is risk mitigation or spreading out risk. I have a background in networking and network security. I work in security right now. I'm looking at telecom companies because I understand fiber, I understand racks, I understand data centers and pieces like that. I'm not completely tossing out my whole thing and going to be a titan of industry in plumbing. And so when we talk about risk level, I don't feel comfortable going after plumbing, but I feel comfortable looking at telecom and data because I understand I would need to lead there and I understand it. So there is a bit of it's not like so explicit of I'm jumping into a brand new thing always. It's going like, well, I still have the background in leadership, or I still have seen these things, or I'm pulling skills forward regardless.
Yeah. Well, and that's a very valid point as well. And that's what starts to emerge when you're building your investment thesis. You start to pay attention to the areas where you do have incredibly strong skills and experience that can pull through into the new venture, because at some level there's no denying that one question a banker is going to ask or an investment banker is going to ask: do I believe this person? Do I believe they've got the wherewithal to pull this off? Forget the numbers for a moment. Let's just talk about the wannabe buyer. And there are going to be moments in your process where your banker, and if you are using an equity fund of some sort, those representatives are going to be asking that question. Does this person's story make sense to me? Do I see the transition and the move into this realm? Can I see a picture forward that's going to work? So the more you can do proactively to put valid parameters around that, and ultimately, Nick, in your case, using your example, make a case strong as hell. You've got the telecom, you're the perfect guy to go take over a telecom related company. Okay, anybody else?
Yeah, so just to
James?
kind of ping back to, so yes, right. So I have been doing my own thing for quite a while, right? But I also do, even in that case, right? So I've primarily just been a sole proprietor, right? Doing individual consulting, which in and of itself has kind of led to, I mean, there was a period of 5 years, right, where I had one client, one large client, right, which kind of happened. I feel like that's the natural order of things. Is if you're one guy and you don't set out to hire employees and spread the load or what have you, right? I was kind of just comfortable making a very good living, right? Had one large client, right? And it was almost like a job, right? So it was basically, I might as well have been on their payroll, right? Like to that extent, right? They might as well just hired me and put me on their salary, right?
Yeah.
Now it wasn't as tax advantageous for them to do it. There was a discussion around that at one point, right? I was like, no, that doesn't make sense, right? And I always had bigger dreams and aspirations. But yeah, so that was I had a more tipped point, but I completely forgot where I was going with that, so I apologize.
That's okay.
Basically, I know the comfort and security of like the paycheck, and it's just going to come in, right? I've had like year-long contracts that were renewed. And it's like almost like the W-2, right?
Sure.
Where it's like, and it is hard to walk away from. So like, that's because having customer concentration in any business it's a double-edged sword of comfort and ease, like lack of complexity, and then also risk, right? That they could go away. Just like you could lose your job at any time. That's a motivating factor for a lot of people, is like, hey, I have this job, I'm replaceable, right? So that was one of the main reasons that kind of set me off on my own path, where I was like, I got laid off one time, right? I was making pretty good money, and then I got laid off after an acquisition. I was just like, what the hell just happened here? Right?
Right.
I was like, what the heck? And I was like, that's never going to happen again. I was like, I never want that to happen again. Right.
Right.
So that's, same. That was kind of what I was getting at.
Right.
Yeah.
Casey, you've got something? We got you on mute, buddy.
I clicked the wrong button. I unraised my hand. Yeah, in this risk conversation, I've had kind of an interesting observation, a conversation with some parent friends. My friend's child has kind of some neurodiversities, and he struggles with like wanting to do things, but then getting scared, freaking himself out. Like he got to go fly in an airplane, and he backed out, or he almost backed out because he didn't feel right in his body. And it's good. We have to listen to our bodies, right? But then I found myself in the situation, like proceeding in this business acquisition. Like, you're damn right, I don't feel right in my body. But I have to recognize, and luckily I have a real estate background where every time I close on a property, I'm so nervous. It's a scary thing. But you have to realize that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It's just a big thing. And so, we have to recognize how we feel risk in our bodies, how we deal with risks, how do we mitigate them. But it's just been really interesting. And so I've been trying to tell my parent friends, like, let him know too that like your body's not always right. Sometimes your body's just excited. Sometimes it's so exciting it feels the same as being scared or something you shouldn't do. And certainly been going through that. And all the same things that Paul's talking about, kind of how much older can I get and still make this a viable option? How much am I trading versus my salary versus what benefits I might get as an owner? All those things are really big considerations and things that you got to work through.
Yeah, for sure. Well, good. Anyone else before we move on? Any other thoughts about this whole risk mindset? Well, I will close that thought with this observation. As I've had the chance to work with a lot of you individually and hear you on these calls, I will kind of, this is a broad brush stroke, categorically, I applaud everyone here that clearly you have probably done the right thing in doing some form of your own risk evaluation, risk assessment, and you've been able to define some sort of boundary of how far you'll go, how deep you'll reach to make this thing come together. Else, at this point, you probably would have bailed, or even more so, you maybe would have never made it quite this far, because those challenges would have become so compelling and so overwhelming that you weren't going to be willing to keep pressing forward. So everybody's raised some great points here. One thing I'd like to kind of move on with is the notion that when you are the one in charge, one of the immediate things that hits the top of the list as a premium in terms of skill and ability is your own ability to ping back and forth between really solid decision making in the very traditional sense of the word, heavy analysis, heavy review, fact finding, etc., to the other side of the spectrum, which is absolute wing it improvisation. I don't have any data. I've got to just make a decision, and I've got to improvise what I'm going to do. So talk to us a little bit about that. Share maybe the kind of the extremes of what you've encountered in your journey so far. Anybody have anything, maybe a story or an example they want to share?
Could you explain again? Sorry, just reiterate the question again.
Yeah, well, I'll frame it this way. So, in the when it comes to controlling your own destiny, you're going to be the final decision maker, right? So, there's going to be a spectrum there of your opportunity. On one end of the spectrum is making a decision that is fully informed, heavily vetted, heavily researched, analyzed, evaluated, consulted, etc. And then there's going to be those moments where you know you need to make a decision, but you don't have time for all that fact finding, all that number crunching. You've just got to go with your gut. You got to be able to say yay or nay, let's do this, or no or not. And that creates a little bit of a conundrum. And again, part of it goes back to risk tolerance. If you don't like making decisions without all of the data handy, you know, this could be a challenge for you. But if you're okay knowing that occasionally you got to wing it, you got to just totally improvise in the moment, you know, how has that worked out for you so far?
So for me, specifically, I've always just in general been comfortable with that premise. Obviously, the more data, the better. But what I've noticed is when I do have to make those decisions like that, right, where you don't have all the information and it's like a best guess or, like you said, a gut feeling, or, you know, you just got to kind of take what you have, is always, you know, when you do make those decisions, make sure you're monitoring the results of that, right? Whatever it is, you know what I mean? So if you make the decision, always be looking for information to inform that decision that you made, right? Whether it was right or wrong, and if you need to change it or, you know, make a different decision, right? Or maybe, you know, go the other way that you were leaning, maybe you were 50-50 and you kind of went left and maybe you should have went right. And just, you know, not just making the decision without the information and then just letting it go, you know, and be like, okay, made that decision, right? Making sure that you're tracking it, right? Whatever it may be, if that makes sense, right? So
Yeah.
that's, you know.
No, I think what I heard you describing is basically in those moments where you do have to make the gut decision, it will be smart to do a little bit of a postmortem and see if there was a learning from that you then can carry forward and know that, you know, maybe there are other factors that could have shown up in the moment or not, and just be aware of any learning that may come from that time when you had to make that spot decision without the benefit of a whole lot of data or analysis time.
Yeah, to help your future times when that comes up.
To help your
basically.
future. Because yeah, if I've learned anything in this business world, you know, everything you encounter will come around again one way or another. And whether it's a function of the next level of growth in your business has a natural way of making old things reemerge or happen again at a different scale, or just the fact that maybe it becomes a systemic indicator that there really is a problem that never got addressed properly. Therefore, the symptom is going to keep recurring until you tackle it and make the change you might need to make.
Yeah, I think you said it well, Doug, about it. It comes back around again. I'm not a poker player, but I always justify my spot decisions by saying, like, I have this set of cards in my hand right now. This is the cards I have. I'd love to see what the next hand looks like, but I don't. And so when I reflect, as James is saying, after a couple hands, I go, well, this is what I had. I would have loved, but that's okay. I made the best decision I could at the time with the knowledge I had, and I'm okay with that. And it comes back around. There's always another hand.
Yep, for sure. Well, okay, in the sake of time here, I would like to move on to one other point that was raised at the start and talk a little bit about, and this I'll admit and I'll disclose, this is one of my favorite subjects to talk about, is the difference between management and leadership. And I don't recall exactly who brought that up. Casey, maybe that was you, I think, that might have said it in your note, your comments. I will tell a quick story. I've been doing leadership coaching now for almost 18 years, and I used to ask people the question when I got a new client. I would ask them, do you think there's a difference between management and leadership? And there was once upon a time, that was a quandary. Not everybody was sure, but I guess we've been enlightened or evolved as a people. And I stopped asking that question because I discovered everybody was answering it. Yes, of course there is. So the real question is, what do you think is the difference between management and leadership? I'll give you guys a chance to run that one around. Anybody have a definition that you've kind of landed on how to know and work toward the difference between the two?
Um, I I will self-admit I don't have really any experience in this, but I think of management as dealing with problems. Things happen and they need solutions, they need some action. They come up and something's got to happen so that they don't derail everything. And leadership, I think of more as planning. So where are we at now and where do we want to be? And so leadership I think of as proactive and management is a lot more reactive.
That's fair. I fundamentally wouldn't disagree with you, and I'll elaborate here in a minute. Any other thoughts real quick? Well, let me kind of fast forward in what I'll share with you. What I typically end up talking to people about, I reflect on. I've got a good friend who a number of years ago got inspired by and curious about this question, and he did a deep dive survey with about 30 really high performing CEOs and talked about how they've led their organizations and their industries to great things. And when he put all the data together out of all his findings, he was surprised by the simple answer he got to that question. And the answer was this: management is about process and leadership is about people. And as he and I talked about that, and as I've reflected on that over the years and got to thinking about it, I can't disagree. I have known individuals, and primarily in the corporate world, and truly we're going to find it here in the entrepreneurial world. They have managed their businesses pretty successfully in terms of profit and loss. They've made money doing what they do. They've found ways to land new deals, find new customers, get their billing done, get their collection done, grow a market, add a service, create a product, whatever. And they're doing that. But when you look at the history of the company, the story about the people in the business is not always a good one. A lot of times what you'll find is the tenure is bad. You know, people have been there 2 years or less. That's one of the reasons in our own PNC teaching that we have, we do encourage you when you're looking at skills matrix and clarity boards, we want to really lean heavily on the tenure of the team, because teams that have no seniority, have no long-term players, are usually indicative of an owner who might have been a good manager, but he wasn't a great leader. And when you get into those businesses, if that has been the legacy, you will struggle because the people are going to be very easily convinced that, you know, you're nothing but bad news to them, and they probably ought to go look for another job because they didn't feel a connectedness, they didn't feel a security in what they had. But if you find the companies that have this better tenure, you're going to realize the people believe in something else that's bigger than the owner. The former owner has been able to create a picture of some other greater good that's bigger than themselves, and they've gotten their people to buy into it. And that's where really effective leadership can shine, is that ability to inspire people to think of a bigger picture think of a greater good, have something to show up for every day and work to achieve. And leaders are able to help people find that journey. And it often starts by you as the new owner being able to tell a story about where you would like to see the business going, the kind of opportunity you see that is there because, and this is really important, because they've worked hard to get it where it is today. And if you can bridge that and use that as a leverage point to say, I admire and respect what you have been able to do as a business. I see nothing but possibility in what we now can do together. And we have heard that time and time again when we've gotten into some of these companies with the AEs that take them over. You might have heard me tell this story recently. Everybody knows about Noah Weiss's Wired Electric acquisition that closed in February. Simple, easy example. About on day 3, he was walking through the warehouse with the guy that he thought was going to be his GM and said to him, you know, I'm curious about this warehouse. And what he was really saying is the warehouse was a trash heap. There was no organization. It was cluttered. It was disorganized. And this person who was a long tenured employee said, you want this cleaned up? You want this organized? That's great. I've been trying to get the seller to do this for years and he won't give me time to do it. But if you see this looking different and behaving differently, I'm all in. I will help you get there. I can start tomorrow. And so there was this pent up demand of what could have been a better solution and a better basis for the company to operate. So it was a very quick win for Noah to be able to tap into that energy and say, yeah, you bet, it's yours. If you want to do that, let's go for it. I'm all in. So you will be able to find those kind of opportunities with the teams you inherit if, and this is the one qualifier, if as you're doing your skills matrix and your roster assessment of these companies, be sure you're seeing that longer tenure team where maybe as many as half of the team have some long-standing experience with the company. And if it's thinner than that or less experience than that, I'm not saying it's going to be a bad deal, but I'm just saying your people side, your leadership demand is going to be much greater on day one when you're walking into a situation like that. So just be cautious as you're thinking about it. Okay.
Doug, may I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Just, would you see that as an opportunity?
A short tenured staff?
Yeah, in other words, if we take the assumption that a longer tenured staff with better leadership will perform better in the long term, something as a short tenured staff, says, hey, I can improve this and I'm going to get significant benefits from that the company has not seen. Or is that just a overly optimistic?
No, I would argue, and here we are. Ironically, if you and I had an hour or two to crack a few beers and get into this, really what we're going to find is somewhere in the basis of that is our own wiring on risk tolerance and evaluation of opportunity. But I'm with you, and my direct answer to your question is yes, I think it could be an opportunity. The question is, do you have the leadership horsepower to make it become something? And, that's a question, we have to explore. And for somebody that maybe is coming out of a corporate gig that was highly technical, never really people oriented much, getting into a situation like that might be a bigger challenge versus the person who is already very familiar with team leadership, making teams work, making pre-existing teams do better. You know, in the corporate world, when managers move around, they seldom get to build teams. They usually inherit teams. And you're usually reassigned or transferred or promoted and moved in to a pre-existing part of the organization. And so you inherit all of the legacy, all of the history that comes with that. And again, just like this scenario, you might be inheriting a team that doesn't have a lot of good tenure, doesn't have a lot of good expertise. Maybe that's a reflection on the prior manager. I don't know, but you've got an opportunity to make a difference. So yes, I mean, fundamentally that always is indicative of an opportunity. Question would be, how can you leverage that and how can you make it happen? And I, in that scenario, would start with a real focus on my one-on-one interviews with the team and really try to dig for ideas that they may have that have never been allowed to see the light of day. And if you can leverage some of their knowledge and ideas that for whatever reason the prior owner never wanted to allow to happen, you might get some immediate buy-in for who and what you're going to be as the new owner.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know we're kind of coming up on the top of the hour here, but appreciate everybody's attention. Anybody have any last? Oh, James, you've got something?
Yes. So related to tenure. So this is, funnily enough, the deal I'm under LOI on is almost the opposite. Like they have very long tenure, right? He's got a management layer. They've all been with the company for 20 years, right? It's an e-commerce business, so very technology focused. Even their order pickers are like 4 or 5 years tenure, right? So, and that's kind of happened through expansion and then contraction, right? So they grew and then contracted and they kept the longest standing people because they were better. But so what I'm getting at with that is when you inherit a team that is very tenured, right? And maybe they're underperforming, right? So like maybe, so like maybe there's problems, right? Process problems, maybe they're poor leaders and, the owner was just kind of hands off. Maybe the leader in person is friendly with that so there's like personal biases. Obviously we're all humans and there's, I know how office politics goes. And so basically what I'm getting at is that almost a double-edged sword, right? Because like, what if you need to get rid of people that have tenure, right? Or you need to change out these people. And then all these people have been with each other for so long that that's almost like a, house of cards, maybe. I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I've never had to do that or deal with that, but I might have to, basically.
Well, trying to be as objective as possible, I would say it's potentially a double-edged sword. And one of the first kind of markers I use when I find a situation like that, again, I would rely heavily on the one-on-one interviews to try to steer the questions I may ask about the dynamics. How are they really doing as a team with this long legacy, this long familiarity with one another? And if they truly have created this dynamic flywheel that is just turning at full speed, full momentum, hard to interrupt, hard to break down, that's a good thing, right? And you would not want to do something that would disrupt that. But there's also the potential that there was a level of comfort and familiarity that just let everybody get into these grooves that aren't especially productive, aren't especially dynamic, but they work, they're convenient, everybody likes showing up, and that's what they're going to do. So your question there would be, how is that going to play in either way? How is that going to play into your long-term vision of where you think you can take the company? Is that going to support your vision, or is it going to be a hindrance to your vision?
Yeah. So it's almost, Yeah, basically. So like the same risk of a low tenured force, you know,
Yeah.
maybe it's because
Yeah.
it's toxic at the top and people are churning through. It's like a long tenure could also be, you know, people are comfortable, right? Coasting, you know, they're friendly, they like what they do, but they're not the people to get it to the next level, right? To like, you know, and then changing that dynamic kind of changes everything. And maybe that's just a slow process, right? Maybe you just got to be eyes wide open going into it, which is kind of what I'm doing, right? Is
That's right.
you know, knowing
That would be
that and then planning, you know, for that.
Yeah, that's it. Well, all right, everyone. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're right at the top of the hour. Thank you so much for sitting in. We will have more information coming soon about our next week's call, so pay attention. We will get the email chain worked out properly and be back in touch. But good seeing everybody. Go out there and have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend. See you guys.